Hi, this is Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. So our first question is from Bonna Wheeler from the White River Valley Union School District. And the question is, when I'm talking about doing good management for our forest, am I talking about cutting individual trees or cutting patches of trees? When I'm talking about managing forests, I'm talking about really both things. So as we think about how to manage our forests with an ecological approach, which includes wildlife habitat, the health and resilience of forests as whole systems, we should be both thinking about harvesting individual trees to help our trees that are the healthiest grow, and also constantly thinking about creating pockets of new regeneration, creating opportunities for new trees to grow in these gaps of all different shapes and sizes. So if a forest is just left to its own devices and is growing and developing naturally, what we would see is that trees would be competing with each other. As they compete with each other, some trees would sort of lose. They would not be able to compete with their neighbors as well as their neighbors are, and so they would die. And so then you'd see sort of individual tree mortality. We're also talking about groups of trees dying. So this would be from something like an insect or disease outbreak, from a windstorm, from an ice storm, something like this. A lot of times in the forest, you wouldn't see a single tree die from something like this. You would see a bunch of trees in a little pocket die. So if that pocket is, let's say, from 1/10 of an acre to several trees to a bigger size like an acre, we'd call that a group opening. And if it's bigger than an acre, we call it a patch opening. So we're trying to manage forests through an ecological forestry approach to sort of to manage them like they manage themselves. So the benefit of cutting individual trees is that you can take trees that are really healthy, which are growing really well, and which represent a diversity of different tree species. So making sure we have lots of different tree species is really important. And you can make it so that those individual trees that you want to grow are less stressed out from competing with their neighbors. So what you'll see is that in especially forests where the trees are all about the same age, as they grow up, they will compete with each other very aggressively. And over time, this will be resolved by individual trees dying. But the process of competition is very stressful because these trees have to put a lot of energy into competing with their neighbors. And so in this time when our climate is changing, which is stressing out trees, they are exposed to exotic invasive insects and exotic invasive plants. Sometimes it's useful to sort of put our thumb on the scale and really try and grow our healthiest trees so that they can be less stressed. And them being less stressed will give them more tools to respond to a changing climate and these other stressors that I talked about. At the same time, we don't want to grow a forest that looks like a park. That's not how forests naturally grow and develop over time. That's not what old growth forests look like. We want to grow a forest that has a diversity of different tree species, but also a diversity of different tree sizes and tree ages. And so in many cases, we'll take pockets of unhealthy trees and cut all the trees in a group. We're basically simulating one of those natural disturbance events like a windstorm or an ice storm or something like that, in order to create a pocket of new regeneration. So one of the benefits of harvesting groups of trees is that we're presenting a lot of different ages and sizes of trees, and that wildlife require different tree species, different sizes and ages at different times in their life. So a good example of this is warblers, like the black-throated blue warbler. They nest in low, short, regenerating young trees. And so by creating a forest which has a representation of all different sizes and ages of trees, we know that we'll have that young forest. We'll also have habitat for species of birds, for instance, that need mid-sized trees and that need tall trees, and that there are some species of birds which require all of these different canopy layers, all of these different tree heights at different times in their life. Also, when we're creating these disturbances, we can get stuff like blackberries and raspberries, which many of our different species of birds and also bears and other things love to eat those berries, and which we wouldn't be able to get regeneration of blackberries and raspberries if we were just cutting individual trees because there wouldn't be enough light. We also know that just creating gaps in the canopy, inside those gaps, the temperatures will be higher, That means we'll get more insects flying around, which means that the many species of birds that we have that eat insects will be able to perch on one side of the gap, fly through the gap, catch insects on the wing, and then eat them perched somewhere on the other side of the gap. And so there's a lot of benefits to creating these large openings. We also know that forests, which have many different sizes and ages of trees, are more resilient to many different things. So what being resilient means is just that you are able to continue being a healthy forest and continue all the natural processes of forest growth and development no matter what comes your way. So if it's a change in climate, which we know we have to deal with, if it's natural disturbances of increased severity and increased frequency, which we also expect to be in our future, having forests which are not just all one thing, not just all trees of the same size, the same age, the same species, allows the forest as a system to have more tools in its toolkit to be healthy no matter what happens. One of the things that is weird about the way that people see forests is that many of us intuitively think that a forest which is dominated by trees that are all the same size, all the same age, looks really, really neat and well taken care of. But actually, healthy forests are often comprised of trees of all different sizes and ages. So it's sometimes really hard to convince people you should not just cut individual trees to make your forest all neat and perfectly spaced trees everywhere, but you should also be creating some pockets for regeneration, which looks really messy, but is actually more synonymous with forests that are healthy and resilient. In addition to that, in those gaps, in those groups, those holes that we're creating in the forest, you should leave them looking extra messy. So leaving tree tops, leaving dead wood in those gaps, leaving trees that are dead and standing are all ways to actually make those groups that we're intentionally creating more like natural disturbances, and that all those features individually have tremendous wildlife value. So we're doing more than just creating a forest which looks good. We're creating a forest which has all these different features which are really useful to wildlife and are also synonymous with long-term forest health. Now what you see behind me is a gap that I've created intentionally by cutting a group of trees in an area that's about 1/4 of an acre. So within this area I cut pretty much all the trees. Now when most people look at this, they would see devastation. They see that a bunch of trees have died here and it's totally bad. But what you need to understand is that with forests, the development of the forest is a process that is continuous. There is no end point, and that when trees fall over, whether we put them on the ground through felling them, or if they fall over naturally, that this hasn't stopped being a forest. This is just a forest that has gone from being an older forest to being a younger forest. What will happen in this gap in a couple of years is it will fill in with regeneration of new trees. Maybe it'll start with some herbaceous species, different types of plants. Then it'll move into raspberries and blackberries and these other species which we call early successional species, which are really, really good at growing fast and colonizing these open areas. And eventually over time it will develop into a mix of all these native tree species. In Vermont, we don't plant trees usually. We rely on this natural regeneration to respond to these disturbance events. So what will happen is just by creating light, just by creating an opportunity for new trees to grow, there will be a boom of regeneration in here. And we'll have a forest which went from being like this forest, pretty simple, dominated by a single age of trees, to a forest which has much more complex, diverse, irregular, vibrant wildlife habitat, and which is also growing more like an old growth forest.